There's no question about it, in AD 175, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, now approaching his 15th year of rule, was in the midst of a serious crisis. His co-emperor Lucius Verus was dead. The Antonine Plague continued to rage in numerous cities in the Roman Empire. A major war on Rome's northern front, which was essentially supposed to be a cakewalk, had instead turned into a quagmire that bogged down tens of thousands of Roman soldiers, and there was no end in sight. And then, as we learned last time, Marcus was betrayed by one of his top generals, Avidius Cassius, governor of the East, including the powerful grain-producing region of Egypt, had declared himself emperor. And Marcus's regime, which seemed so strong only a few years prior, was crumbling before his eyes. Would Marcus Aurelius be able to stop this crisis? We'll talk about it on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 53, The Darkest Years of Marcus Aurelius. As we saw last time, Marcus Aurelius was in a lot of trouble by the year 175 AD. I won't recap everything I just said in the introduction, but it was bad. It was pretty bad. Marcus had just escaped his deathbed by the skin of his teeth. His wife thought that he was going to die, and so she had sent a letter to Marcus's leading general, Avidius Cassius, in the East, advising him to consider taking the empire and her hand in marriage should Marcus indeed die, as it looked like he was going to. This would stabilize the empire. Her son Commodus was not old enough yet to take over, and so this seemed like the best idea. But there may have been something else going on with Commodus at this time. He was about 13 or 14 years old, not old enough yet to take over the empire in case his father died. Galen, the imperial physician that attended both Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, claims, but only in one place, that Commodus got sick at this time, the same time as his father. Now, Galen says that Commodus just got a mild sickness, and that there was really nothing wrong with him, and that other people were imagining that the young prince had faced a more serious disease. But I think there are some strange clues in the way that Galen talks about what happened to Commodus. The official story is this. Commodus came down with what was basically a sore throat. He was given medicine by a doctor, other than Galen, that was not particularly useful and may have made his symptoms worse. And then Galen stepped in with a better remedy that began to heal Commodus. Meanwhile, his crazy aunt and her team of doctors kept interfering with what Galen was trying to do. Evidently, Commodus's aunt was terrified that Commodus was going to die, but Galen, ever the calm and careful doctor, was able to convince her that Commodus would be just fine, and he recovered, and that's it. There's really nothing to say about it. However, I find a few things interesting. First of all, the symptoms. Commodus had a fever, and he had something wrong with his throat. The medicine that Galen gave him was medicine normally given for people with ulcers in the throat. A fever and ulcers in the throat were two of the most common symptoms of the disease responsible for the Antonine Plague. And it might be true that Commodus's aunt was just a kind of paranoid woman, and her fears about her nephew were unsubstantiated. But an alternative reading of what happened was that Commodus really was unwell, and his aunt was justified in being afraid. And there is a curious artifact that survives. It was found in Spain. It is an image carved in a gem of a young Commodus. And on the other side of the image is a legend that speaks to Commodus recovering from a major illness. If this is a different illness than the one that Galen speaks about, we have no record of it, which is odd. A more plausible explanation, in my mind, is that Commodus may have actually been very sick, or at least had some initial symptoms of the disease responsible for the Antonine Plague, and was thought to possibly die. And so his aunt has this gemstone carved after he recovers in gratitude. And Galen, in turn, would minimize the disease because it struck Commodus right around the same time as some other disease, or perhaps the same disease, also struck Marcus. In other words, the dynasty itself was under threat of being wiped out by illness. That, in turn, might explain why Faustina wrote that letter to Avidius Cassius. She not only thought her husband was going to die, but she was worried her son too would die. And so she was trying to ensure her own survival by proposing a marriage to Avidius Cassius and a transfer of the empire. Again, all we can do is speculate. This is at best an ancient conspiracy theory because we simply don't have the evidence and we never will. But it certainly seems to me that something very serious was wrong in Marcus's family and his empire more generally. He had lost the provinces of Egypt and Syria and several other eastern territories. He had lost his most important military leader. I'm sure that he was questioning the fidelity and faithfulness of his wife. And there was a question as to whether he would even be able to keep his troops. You have to remember, Marcus was never a military leader. The war against Persia, which had been fought by the Romans in the early to mid 160s, was not won by Marcus Aurelius. It was won by his adoptive brother and co-emperor at the time, Lucius Verus. Marcus really had nothing to do with that war. And the troops that were fighting right now in the Marcomannic War were partly Lucius Verus's troops from Parthia, at least the ones that had survived both that war and the disease that swept through the soldiers and the cities of the Roman Empire after that war. Some of them were also new recruits. And then the rest of the soldiers that were fighting in that war were Germanic peoples themselves that were fighting on the Roman side because of various treaties, some of which were not being held to. So the military that Marcus had at his disposal in the western part of the Roman Empire near the Danube River was a questionable loyalty to him. And here was Avidius Cassius over in the east with the promise of a much stronger empire and a brand new dynasty to take things over. I really think that this was a pivotal moment in Roman history. And had things gone different, I think it would take a central place in the history books. However, two things happened that enabled Marcus Aurelius to recover his empire, and I think it was on the brink of going over to Avidius Cassius. Here are the two things that happened. For one, Marcus's soldiers, for whatever reason, decided to stick with him. How close were they to turning on him? Well, I think we can look at the coinage for a potential answer. In the year 175, Marcus's coins carried a legend which had never been seen on his coinage. It was a simple image, two hands clasping across a military standard, with a legend that reads, if you translate the Latin to English, something like the harmony or the concord of the soldiers. Now, I have actually mentioned this legend at least once already on this podcast. If you go back to the episode on Nerva, which is episode 28 of this podcast, I believe I mentioned that legend in that episode as well. And why did this image of supposed martial fidelity appear under Nerva? Well, because the Emperor Nerva had been kidnapped and held by his own guards, and it was almost certain that the emperor faced a coup, and he was being pressured to pick a successor from a different family, but one that his soldiers wanted to see leading the empire. You have almost the exact same circumstances here under Marcus Aurelius. Another period in which this coin legend appeared was in AD 69, which you know from episodes 23 and 22 was called the Year of the Four Emperors. There was rampant civil war in the Roman Empire after the death of Nero, and it was very unclear who the Roman soldiers were supporting. They were supporting all sorts of different emperors at different times. In other words, I think the fact that Marcus trucks out this coin legend is actually a sign that there was real insecurity about who the military would pick to be emperor. and that the threat from Avidius Cassius was very real indeed. Now, as I said, the soldiers picked Marcus, and we don't know exactly why, but they may have been helped by the second thing that occurred, which enabled Marcus to keep his empire. And that is, Avidius Cassius, after being emperor for just a few months, was assassinated by one of his subordinates. And it's crazy to me because we don't know the guy's name. It was just a lower level officer, a centurion, that killed Avidius Cassius and actually sent Avidius's head to Marcus. The actions of this unnamed man may have forever altered the history of the Roman Empire. We don't even know who he was. It's really incredible. Once Avidius Cassius was dead, his chief ally, the governor of Syria, decided to burn all of Avidius Cassius's personal documents, his letters, any promises that he made, any orders that he gave and wrote down. This move, of course, would have protected senators, commanders, and maybe even family members, and maybe even some of Marcus Aurelius's family members, like his wife, if they had indeed been plotting with Avidius Cassius to overthrow Marcus Aurelius. And it's because of this action that Faustina, Marcus's wife, that her involvement in this whole thing is just a rumor. Cassius Dio, the Roman senator who was alive at the time, cannot give us proof that Faustina was involved, although it is curious that she would die less than a year later, supposedly of natural causes, but who really knows? Marcus did seem, however, to be of a mind to forgive people, so maybe she did die of natural causes. He does not prosecute this governor of Syria. If some of his soldiers and commanders contemplated turning, we don't read anything about any of them being punished. What we do know is that Marcus Aurelius clearly needed to give attention to the eastern half of the empire. He had been bogged down in the Marcomannic War for more than half a decade at this point. The Antonine Plague had also been raging, and Marcus had been stuck in the West. He needed to give attention to the East. And so he gathered several thousand soldiers from the front, including a few thousand Germanic soldiers, and he just left the war. Since Marcus was leaving, his diplomats helped him to reach a hasty set of treaties with several of the most important Germanic tribes that the Romans were fighting. These would not last. I'm sure that the diplomats themselves knew that they would not last. But the point was, Marcus had to get to the east, or he just risked somebody else taking that territory. It was obviously very easy for Avidius Cassius to declare himself emperor, and while there was not necessarily a man like him waiting in the wings, it might not be long before somebody tried it. And the only thing that stopped Avidius Cassius was essentially an accident of fate. Had that centurion not killed his commander, historians to this day might be talking about the emergence of a new dynasty in 175. By the end of the year, he arrived in Egypt, the very center of the rebellion of Avidius Cassius. He received a huge welcome, as everybody, of course, wanted to make amends and show their loyalty to the emperor, as though just a few months ago, they were not all willing to fight and die for Avidius Cassius. Marcus would stay in Egypt over the winter, and then he would head back to Rome. Marcus's presence in the East seemed to be enough to shore up loyalty. But it was not enough to arrest the crisis that was still continuing to unfold in the aftermath of wars, plague, and food supply shortages. Before he even made it back to Rome, Marcus had to commission some of his officers and soldiers to put down criminal activity in the eastern half of the empire. What was happening? It's a little bit unclear from the source material. After all, nobody really wanted to say anything bad about Marcus Aurelius, and so to speak of the disorder that was happening would have been a little bit of a slight on the emperor. So instead, we have these vague hints of what sound like gangs, bandits, brigands, small groups of outlaws roving around mostly Asia Minor, terrorizing small towns, committing acts of robbery in cities, and, unfortunately for Marcus, growing in power. Who were these people? We don't entirely know, but I think we can make some educated guesses. First, we know that the finances of Marcus's government were in a terrible state. They had been drained by wars. The decreased production during the Antonine Plague also seems to have affected the imperial coffers. And I don't think Marcus reduced taxes, and he certainly didn't reduce government spending. In other words, the government was demanding the same level of taxes, maybe more, and people simply did not have what was required to pay. Now, the most common way that people dealt with not being able to pay their taxes in many ancient societies, and this is true of the Roman Empire as well, was simply picking up and leaving. Roman tax collection was merciless. You didn't just get a warning letter. The authorities didn't set up a payment plan for you. It wasn't even the case that things got repossessed, although that could happen. What happened was you were kidnapped and you were thrown into some kind of horrible debt bondage where you went to a mine or a quarry or something like that. And if you couldn't be found, your relatives were captured and they were tortured until they gave up your location. Roman tax collection was absolutely brutal, and you did not want to be around if you owed even a small amount of taxes. And so what do? You flee. So during a time of fiscal crisis, as there appears to have been under Marcus Aurelius, you would have a high number of tax fugitives hiding out in the countryside. They have to make a living somehow. You also have hints in several sources of runaway slaves at this time. These people were also outlaws. They could not rejoin society very easily. They could not always hide their identity as slaves. And so they too may have been hiding out in the countryside. Finally, there was a third group, and I think this was probably the most prominent group among these outlaws. These were soldiers that had deserted the army. Through a combination of losses from war and plague, the legions were in desperate need for soldiers back in the mid to late AD 160s. We're told that Marcus Aurelius allowed recruiters to take in people they would not normally take, including slaves and criminals. These men were given military training, some weapons, and they were sent to the front. And as we know from the last episode, the front ended up being a terrible place to be. It was a quagmire. There was very little to gain in the way of booty, and there was a lot of risk in terms of loss. Not just loss of life, but let's just say some of these soldiers lost a few pieces of gear, a sword, a helmet, armor. They were expected to pay to replace those items. A suit of armor for a Roman soldier was about a year's salary. These were not cheap items. And as the war dragged on, and some of these people were in it for years and years and years, they had decisions to make. Should they continue to stay and fight a war for which there seemed to be no personal benefit? Or might they take their training and the weapons that they have been given and decide to fight easier victims? People inside the Roman Empire, peasants in towns. And I think that's exactly what happened. I think these bandits that we read about in Asia Minor, and by the way, banditry would expand over the next decade into the western half of the Roman Empire as well. I suspect that these roving bands of brigands were runaway slaves, tax dodgers, and ex-soldiers, all living as outlaws, all banding together for mutual benefit to pillage the cities of their own empire. So despite the fact that the rebellion of Avidius Cassius was over, the troubles from Marcus Aurelius continued. And if anything, they seemed to be getting worse. Marcus returned to Rome, but he was unable to stay there for very long because, of course, this hasty peace that the Romans had put together with several tribes along the Danube broke down within just a couple of years. Marcus, in the late 170s, had to go back once again to the German front and renew the fighting. I have to imagine that Marcus was thinking that this was not what he had signed up for. He had grown up and been groomed to rule in Rome as a philosopher king. His adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, had showered him with titles, had paraded him before the people. His adoptive brother Lucius Verus was the one who was supposed to handle all of this military stuff, and he was dead. Marcus was out of his league and beyond his ability. The sicknesses that he had experienced had ravaged his body, and his empire seemed to be crumbling around him. And in the midst of this period of crisis, Marcus kept a journal, some little writings to himself that he made during the darkest years of his reign. Interestingly, those writings survive. We have them. They are called the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, personal notes that he wrote to himself that were probably never intended to be published, and yet they were. And on the next episode, we will talk about the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, what they reveal of this man who faced the end of the Pax Romana and who would, just a few short years after writing them, finally succumb to death. All that on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.